Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here again, and especially this time with two great industry friends to join a really great conversation. First, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear us properly. So if you can please post in the chat, letting us know that you can hear us, please. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well, it's really great to have you join us today, and I just want to briefly give an introduction here to the two fine gentlemen that are joining the conversation. So please, would like you to welcome David Ryan Polgar, who is joining us today, and also Nate Sawatzky that's joining us. And I've had the huge pleasure of working with them in different capacities and collaborating in different areas. So I'm so excited about the contributions that they have to the 6 essential pillars of a healthy online community talk. And I'm really, really excited. So hi to you, David, and hi to you as well, Nate.
Hello, Carlos.
Hey.
Good to be here.
Well,
Really good to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We also have Leah here, who is really our logistics wizard and who has done so much great work together already. So it's great to have you here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Carlos.
So let's do just a couple of things talking about logistics, right? We will have some time at the end for questions and discussions, and we're really hoping we can have a great discussion at the end. So I encourage you to have your questions and comments for that section there. However, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A feature that you can see on the bottom of your screen there. You can also raise the hand if you prefer to do that, and we're going to be talking to you, addressing your question. And also a note, I know that not everybody may feel comfortable having their name attached to a question for different reasons, right? You may have different confidential reasons. So if that's the case, please just let us know. Maybe just type anonymous question or something like that for us so we can respect your privacy. Otherwise, if you're okay with us just saying who is asking the question, we can also do that. So whatever is more comfortable for you. Okay, so from that, we have already met the panelists. I have ran ahead of the schedule, as you can see here. We're going to be addressing the 6 pillars and talking about each one of those. We have Q&A at the end. And at the very end too of the presentation, what's next? How can we keep the conversation going? What great things are happening in the world of community, trust and safety and beyond? So you have already met the panelists, but here you can see a little bit more about our background and the things we have done in the past and the things that we are doing nowadays. I think there's a really nice and healthy mix in terms of experiences and focus that Nate and David have in the industry. So I'm really, really excited about this. So let's get started. In terms of talking about the 6 pillars of a healthy community, I always like to start here to say, what is the purpose of a community? And understanding that an online community can have very different purposes depending on the platform, on the type of the community, if it's an online game, if it's an app, or if perhaps it is a website, a forum. There are many different types. So recognizing that though, I always like to propose this as a possible definition of what a healthy online community is. And the way I see it is we think about how it has been designed and what is the purpose, the mission, and the motivation for that community. So a healthy community would be where it's possible to fulfill that mission, where it's possible to fulfill those goals. And of course, there are things that will be conducive to fulfilling those goals and to having like a healthy interaction. And there are things that are going to disrupt the fulfillment of those goals. So I would like us to think about those terminologies as well and start moving away a little bit from ambiguous terms that have been used for a long time in the industry that don't necessarily serve us really well. So stepping away from saying toxicity, stepping away from using those words, and rather saying, perhaps we can say negative behavior, we can say antisocial behavior, disruptive behavior, things that are disrupting the achievement of the goals for this community. And just a quick touch point there. I would like to hear if Nate or David have any thoughts about that.
Well, I certainly have some thoughts, and this is David here. I think one of the struggles that a lot of platforms have is trying to strike that kind of perfect balance, the Goldilocks zone, if you will, of an online healthy community that is both welcoming and, as you talk about in this definition, allows users to contribute and act as a kind of a digital citizen, but at the same time still maintain a level of vibrancy. I think that's always tricky, right? It's on one hand, you could always lock down a community to make it safer, but then oftentimes in a kind of a paradoxical kind of fashion, you destroy the very value of the community, right? It's very similar, I think, of how we might approach crime with different countries and their own strategies. So trying to, again, strike that balance where people feel welcome, but it's at the same time still vibrant in nature.
Yeah, and I think it comes also from setting expectations. I mean, communities thrive whenever they are given the opportunity to own the community. I mean, a community by its very nature is self-owned. It's not owned by the community manager or by the company. It needs to be something that everybody in the community feels empowered to contribute to, not just in the content and in the activities, but also in its health. And whenever we're looking at designing the tools and designing the policies and the practices, giving the community the ability to put their footprint on something, but knowing, at the onstart, whenever they joined the community, it wasn't a primordial, goop that they joined. There was something there already. There was some idea, and having a really clear picture of what that expectation is, so that they know, hey, this is something that I can contribute to, or you know what, this isn't my community. This isn't something that represents who I am, and that's cool. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think that it's that understanding that we're talking about humans here, right? We are talking about humans interacting online. Sometimes I think it's easy to forget that, and platforms can have that mentality of either too much regulation and too much enforcement, and it's almost like that thing, us against them, or on the other end, also not really having those expectations that you talked about, Nate, or not really having the practices and the processes for ensuring like a healthy communication. And then you can go, the pendulum can swing far to the either side. And just like David said as well, striking that balance is not easy. But we hope that this talk will help quite a lot to understand a little bit more how to find that balance. So let's start with the first pillar here. And the first one really is super important, because we're talking about the foundation of a healthy online community. And you can see that we're talking about a healthy community by design. So that's at the very essence and foundation of your product, of your game, of your app. So I'm using the term engineering. And I will be talking about the 3 E's. So you will hear this again, but mainly engineering, education, and enforcement. So if we start with engineering, we're really talking about the foundation of that community. And one thing that sometimes products forget to do is to set the tone from the very beginning, to have the systems from the very beginning that are going to be conducive to healthy communication. So you can really see that that quote from David there. He was referring to the Goldilocks zone. He was referring to the vibrancy, to that happy mix. So we need to have this foundation in a way that's not going to be very heavy-handed, neither that's going to have a lot of safety gaps. We really want to be able to strike the right balance. And when we're talking about what does it mean to design safety, though, what does it mean to engineer a healthy community? Well, one challenge that companies face is that many times folks from diverse disciplines, they build those communities and products. Folks from an engineering background, from a product background, but they don't necessarily have the involvement of community professionals, of trust and safety professionals, of online safety professionals. And what can happen there is just there can be a gap in terms of how the product can be misused, what issues can happen in the community. We set out to create a community to fulfill the mission like we talked about. And maybe it's a social media platform where communication can happen. And it's this amazing idea. But then we see that the very thing that can make that community very functional can make it very dysfunctional too. When instead of communicating, people are also spreading fake news and things like that, just to use an example. So how do we do that? How do we have the right practices in place? That's why we talk about the idea of intuitive tools to allow your community team and your moderation team to be able to stay on top of the challenges and to moderate the community, but also to have the opportunity to involve your community as appropriate. So having the community take ownership of the community, it's their community after all. So having the chance for them to report things that go wrong, having the chance for them to block things or to mute, so they are involved in the process and they are empowered. However, it's really key to be able to implement those things from the beginning so you can set the proper tone. Now we get to a point here that I really think that we have some great stories and contributions to share here. And when I say that it's important to have the collaboration of community teams, moderation teams, safety teams, when they are collaborating with the engineering teams and the product teams, is to understand, okay, we're about to add a new feature to our game, or we're about to add a new communication system to our app. I always say, can you actually consider how can this feature be misused, or how can this feature be used for something completely unintended? I was just wondering if either of you would have a story to share here, Nate or David.
Yeah, you know what? This is Nate. I can think of this one. Actually, I got a really good anecdote for this one. So I think that something that happens often in companies is that you have your development team becomes really siloed from the community team. Sometimes companies will divide up the two teams because, let's face it, oftentimes there's the community teams, the support teams are often seen as something less important than the product teams. When we were building up the community team at Club Penguin, that wasn't the thing. Community team was as important to product as the product team was, and product team was as important to community as the community was. And one really good example of how this happened is every time the product team would develop something, it would normally go through a first pass filter on the community team, and the community team would look at it and give their feedback and say, hey, look, like this is how we think the community is going to use it. We think they're really going to like it. We've been hearing them talk about this, and look, like this thing that you're building is really, really cool, but they keep on asking for this other thing. But other times it became really critical. For example, we had this ability where you could put on costumes in Club Penguin. So penguins would put on costumes, and whenever they hit D, the penguins would dance. And if they had certain costumes on, that dance would take on different special kind of actions. And so I can't remember what the event was, but we had this one event where two of the costumes were a ketchup bottle and a mustard bottle. So when the penguins put them on, if this had gone forward, they would have been wearing these kind of cylinder tubes in very kind of, it wasn't particularly HD. And whenever you hit dance, the ketchup bottle would spew ketchup and the mustard bottle would spew mustard. And the community team took one look at it, and for anybody who is listening and is a community person, you're groaning because you know exactly how a 12-year-old boy is going to use a ketchup bottle that squirts out ketchup. So before we ended up inundating the community with condoms, we pushed back on the product team and said, hey, let's do something different because this is probably going to go somewhere bad. And that sort of thing happened. I mean, not all, examples were quite as gory as that, but that ability for the community team to be able to represent the community in those product meetings was really valuable. And it also proved valuable later on too, because those community people, given the way that they were able to interact with the product team, often went on to work in the product team as they progressed in their own skill.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing the story, Nate. I think that's a perfect example of how community can influence the design and the engineering. And really, engineering is so powerful, right? Because if you don't add a feature in the first place, you're not going to have elements that are conducive to antisocial behavior and disruptive behavior in the first place. So an example of this would be, let's say, a game has voice chat. But if you don't have a way of opting out of voice chat, that can be very frustrating for players who normally would, by default, avoid voice chat due to harassment issues that can happen. So when you engineer the option of you are automatically opted out of voice chat unless you opt in, now you're already solving some challenges and giving some possible paths forward by the way you are designing and engineering the product. And I agree with Nate that community plays a great voice as a stakeholder in those conversations. So it's something to really be aware of.
So we have a question from one of our attendees, and I'd actually really love to hear David's take on this. I'll just read out the question here. How do you deal with joining a company where the community hasn't had clear expectations set, has been existing in a disruptive state for a long time? Is it too late? Is it ever too late to set those expectations and turn things around?
It's a complicated question in the sense that it depends on where the user base is deriving from, and if they are deriving their kind of pleasure in the platform from its lack of structure, its lack of safety, which has been the case in a few apps that have grown over the years, that can always be a difficult scenario. Obviously, you have examples like Yik Yak that definitely had a difficult time, hence why it kind of went sideways. But on the flip side, you have different examples like Reddit. Reddit initially was seen as one that took a very kind of liberal kind of viewpoint towards its moderation, whereas in recent years they've definitely had a more kind of thorough discussion around community and how they can try to reduce some of the harassment and other kind of antisocial behavior that was happening on their platform. And I think Twitter is also another interesting example. I remember in 2016, going out there for the Digital Citizenship Summit, like right at that time in October, there was a heavy discussion around whether Disney would buy Twitter at the time. But one of the reasons why they didn't was because of their issues around the behavior that was going on the platform. Now, Jack Dorsey, right, you probably saw about a couple weeks ago, kind of had a few tweets talking about how he underestimated the ability for trolls and other types to kind of misuse the platform. So I think the key takeaway is to always think about not just A to B from an engineering standpoint, but A to Z and how it can be misused. But to go back to the question, I really think it's something that combines with the healthy community, but also with the PR team, in the sense that if you're truly trying to say, all right, we're changing our ways, then you really need to kind of put that out there, and then have all the different aspects of the company be in line with this new you that you're trying to have. Because I think the general public is certainly accepting of companies that said, you know what, we failed to predict what was going to happen. Like I said, I think Twitter is a positive example. They seem to have been able to correct the ship and are slowly changing their perception. If you remember, last year was a terrible year for Twitter and their overall perception, whereas now people seem to really be more optimistic about the guidance. I know they're even sponsoring some research on the wellness of their community that they have. So I do think it's possible, but it's also a heavy lift in the sense that you want to really have all the parts showcase that you're taking this seriously, not just one department, not just trust and safety. It's going to be across all the different visuals and copy that you're using for the company.
Yeah, I want to add to that too, and I think it's really important. Like if you're a new community manager coming into an established company and you've been given some really hard numbers that you're to meet as far as growing the community, and your first impression is, my goodness, we have some unhealthiness here. You may make a call that is going to maybe cause some churn in your community, that some people are going to leave because they're no longer happy. And that's particularly difficult whenever the leadership of the company doesn't support that notion. If the prime objective of the company is to grow the size of the community, and that is more important than improving the health of the community, if you're the community manager in that situation, that's going to be a challenge. So I think, a huge area of focus that you're going to want to spend your first few months on is working upwards and helping the leaders of the company understand the benefits of a healthy community. And even though it may hurt to get there, it's going to be worth it, but you're going to have to lead up. And that can be, I think, a challenge. David, you said one thing, and I was just kind of curious. Are you optimistic that this is changing? I mean, like, is this something that's kind of bound to our time, that whenever we think about, a community that is just kind of open and it doesn't have those boundaries, inevitably seems to sometimes have negative aspects to it. Do you think that'll change as the kids right now that are kids grow up and start to take over, that are a little bit more familiar with this landscape?
I do think it's changing. It's a combination of digital citizenship legislation that's being pushed, and greater training that's now also being aged up. But it's not just that. I think it's also the realization from companies that a healthy community is also a more profitable community, and I think that's what's been kind of helping it. Whereas before, when there wasn't a significant pressure from societal pressure to say, all right, well, clean up your community or else we don't trust it, we're going to leave. I think it allowed for kind of a more libertarian approach. And even if you look in the kind of founding of cyberspace as kind of a movement, right, with the manifesto there in 1997, it kind of took a very hands-off approach, whereas from just everything that's been going on online, I think we have a lot more pressure to kind of button things up. So I think the learned behavior from a lot of businesses, a lot of platforms, is that they have to take this, because it's not just about doing what's right. It's also about doing something that people as consumers are actually demanding, and that's why you see, right, Zuckerberg, he's going to be testifying on April 11th. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around social media platforms being a lot more proactive.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I also believe that there is change in the make. One of the projects that I am involved is co-creating teaching resources to teach digital citizenship and about online etiquette and online behavior through games. And I really believe that it's the very platforms that kids and teenagers are using, the very games and the very apps, they can be a great, fruitful ground to take a good look at this. And we could be looking at a new set, let's say new digital citizens that are going to have both more self-reflection about their own behavior, but also those expectations that you're referring to, that expectation that there needs to be accountability from both sides, from both the platform creators, but also from us as players and users. So we have a question here, a quick question. I think it's very much related to this. So if you have anything else to add, guys, what would be ethical design for those products?
Nate, do you want to run with this?
Sorry, I totally missed the question.
What is ethical design for those products, for those platforms? What would be ethical design?
What?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is going to be immediately passing it back to you, David, because I think ethical design is human design whenever it comes to community, right? It's looking at what are the what's core to that community. If you're building a children's community, what does it mean to be a child? To be a child, it means having fun. It means playing. It also means going outside and running around and getting your hands dirty and playing with things and sometimes breaking things and you know, don't tell my kids this, but occasionally even sometimes getting in trouble. And I think whenever you're designing the safety aspects, really you're trying to design something that's really human. You're trying to design something that allows humans to be humans and doesn't try and force this technique on them to become something different to conform to your business. Your business either serves the people that you're trying to serve, or it's trying to force them into something that they're not. And I think that, you know, particularly if we talk about kids, it becomes a really dangerous and unhealthy thing.
I think just to quickly tack on to that, given the current zeitgeist and conversation, ethical design is also touching upon, as Nate talked about, treating the individuals as humans as opposed to part of the product. You know, you might have seen like that hot discussion going between Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg right now about oftentimes on a social platform, the person might be part of the product, and that can really be dehumanizing to a certain extent, but can also maybe move away from the end goals that person might have, and kind of push them in directions that they're not that are not aligned with their own kind of hopes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We come now to the second pillar, which is so important. It is about team well-being, and it's about the folks who are really spearheading that community. They are safeguarding that community, helping that community thrive, including the player, the user voice, being that champion within the company, having to talk to different stakeholders, having the opportunity to affect design and engineering, bringing feedback. But they are also the ones that are exposed to a lot, the darker side, let's say, of our human behavior. So I think it's so important for us to consider that when we're talking about a community team, we're talking about a moderation team, to be aware of the impact, first and foremost. Be aware of the impact. Either like because your team is reviewing extreme harassing type of chat, or it's bullying, or perhaps it is a sexual type of content that's being reviewed every day, or maybe if they review pictures or videos, understanding that those things have an impact over time, that those are stressors as well, and that the role of a moderator has other stressors like making the right decision, the pressure to make the right decision, the pressure to make sure that you don't mess up, because if you mess up, you're limiting somebody from playing that game. You're limiting somebody from accessing that platform. So your actions have consequences, and we want to be making the best sound decisions we can as moderators. That's a huge pressure. That's a huge burden. So I think it's important for us to discuss ways of coping with reviewing high-risk content. And that goes into understanding how stress affects us, looking at each other in a team and understanding the signs, talking about this, encouraging people to have their own wellness plan. I'm going to have some tips here in a second. And also holding team activities that encourage open and honest communication. So we can spot in each other when things are starting to break down. Because let's face it, we're humans, we have different factors outside of work as well that play into our roles. And we need to understand that reviewing high-risk content is quite the task. So here's some...
I think...
Hey, Nate, go ahead.
No, I was just going to comment on that. I like the light side of whenever we talk about moderators, is we all, any of us who have done moderation know that we see the world just a little bit differently, right? Like we see something and we immediately see the innuendo, whether it's really there or not. We see it sooner than everybody else, and that's kind of just like one of the occupational hazards. But I think it is really important to call out that sometimes we ask a lot of our moderators, and like when we're dealing with kid sites, it's mostly within chat, and we see bullying, and we see kids that are kind of just testing the boundaries of what they can say. In the sense of anonymity, they sometimes will say some pretty shocking things. And as we work with older communities, sometimes it becomes even more. We end up looking at images that are hard to unsee. And I think it's really important that we treat that content as special is the wrong word, but as something that is meant to be touched with it needs to be, reverence again is the wrong word. It needs to be approached as something that's serious. And whenever we approach it casually, it does something to us. It does something to our moderators and our teams. And I think it's always important to call that out, because whenever we treat it casually or with cavalier nature, we are inevitably doing something to our moderators' worldview. They're either going to start to see the world as something that is darker than it is. They're going to start to lose hope. They're going to start to even it'll start to impact the way that they view things like sexuality. And so, I think it's really important to call out that whenever we are thinking about the sort of content, whether it's just light, fluffy stuff for kids or whether it's more heavier stuff, it needs to be treated with a certain level of respect, so that it doesn't become something that starts to shape our worldview in a negative way.
I definitely agree, Nate. Thank you so much for that point. I think it's the mindset, right? When we go and it's time to review, let's say, user-generated reports or reviewing live chat, doing moderation in general, having that respect and understanding what's at stake, coming with the right attitude, and also creating a separation. That's something I have heard from different wellness and resilience trainers, is create a separation. After you finish your work schedule and after you have been moderating, create a gap between that circumstance and your other life activities, your home activities. Just leave the work there, create a separation, give yourself that space. And that's why I also have a few tips here that you can also implement throughout the day, especially when you have a really challenging moderation day. Being extra mindful of those wellness techniques, taking stretch breaks, walks, just taking time away from the screen. If you have games at work, if you have things you can do at work, that's great. Rotating tasks, and even like taking 10 deep breaths. Don't think that those things have no effect. Wellness and resilience trainers show that this is crucial, especially when you have a super stressful day. So please bear that in mind for yourself and for your teams. I have a couple of resources there that are clickable when we send you the PDF from this presentation. One is the Technology Coalition Employee Resilience Guidebook that has a lot of great information, but also this example of how playing Tetris after a traumatic experience can help avoid intrusive thoughts to come into your mind later. So again, having an especially stressful day at work moderating, maybe take a break, play a little bit of a game if you have Tetris. Excellent.
So we actually have a question here, which I think that Nate, having worked with a a global team of moderators. Just so everyone knows, both Carlos and I both worked under Nate at Disney, actually, so we've had a lot of experience with him. The question that I'd love for you to address, Nate, is how do you organize your moderators in different time zones? So someone is always on moderating 24/7. What's the key to getting that full coverage?
Excellent question.
Right. So I mean, this is gonna look different depending on if you're going with something that has a lot of content. So therefore, if there's a lot of user-generated content, a lot of chat, and you really want to try and keep an open community where people, there's a certain amount of risk that you're accepting, then obviously having that 24/7 coverage is really important. If a lot of the work that you're doing is asynchronous, or if there's a really low risk, then I think that 24/7, you want to make sure that really is what you need. For us at Club Penguin and later when Disney acquired us, when we were working with Disney, we did a follow the sun team. So we had in Kelowna, which is Pacific Coast time in Canada, we had our largest team, and we staffed from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. I believe. I think it actually ended up going later, eventually to 12 p.m. And that covered the bulk of the work. But then we had a team that came on later on in the day. In the UK, we set up a team in Brighton, and then again later we moved that on to Sydney. So we literally had 3 teams looking at English, and also for some of the larger languages as well, with Portuguese and French, we had people staffed in those 3 offices as well. And it was hard. It was a challenge setting up the other 2 offices to hold the same sort of values. And again, one of the things that we really wanted to do with Club Penguin in particular was we wanted to make sure that moderators felt very empowered to make the decisions. So we spent a tremendous amount of time on hiring and training. And I think we're going to get to that actually in a little bit, but I can't overemphasize the importance of trying to find ways to transport those cultural elements from one office to the other so that your team is consistent. And there were moments where we weren't. There was moments where, for example, our Sydney team was really out of sync from the Brighton team and the Kelowna team. We didn't spend as much time working with the team there to help get them prepared. And because of the great time difference between there and in Kelowna, we didn't get to spend as much time with them either. So, I mean, there's setting up the physical offices is the best way to do it. At-home teams can be interesting. I think that there's certain circumstances where having an at-home moderation team can be really beneficial, and that obviously eases the burdens. But again, it's the key to being successful in around the globe moderation is hiring the right people and having the right resources and communication triggers.
Answer, Nate. Thank you. So I'll just plow ahead here for the sake of the time, so we can have some really cool discussions at the end. The third pillar is all about message cohesion, and of course those pillars, they are interconnected. Because you're thinking about setting the tone, you set the tone with the way you engineer and design the product, the way that you treat your team, of course, the way that you treat the community. And then how do you communicate with the community, from your code of conduct, your community guidelines, to how you warn users when they go down a path that's questionable? How do you do that? So super important to have clear and concise community guidelines and code of conducts. Make sure that this is forefront, right? It's not a second thought. It's readily accessible. Maybe it's part of the first tutorial. You go through it and the first experience as a user or as a player. So it's right there. It's part of the fabric of your product. And then if you're using warning messages, which I highly recommend for adjusting behavior and for reforming behavior, giving a chance for people to change their behavior, give timely warning messages. They're directly related to why they were warned in the first place. Having a system for automatic warnings is super helpful. And also having advanced communication when you introduce new safety features. Going back to that awesome question we had about what do you do when you join a community that already has a lot of challenges? Well, I think communities are always evolving, always changing. So if you're going to add new features, especially safety features, make sure that players and users are involved and they understand what's at stake here and what's going to change, and do it progressively. at my work here at Two Hat, I have worked with gaming companies who had a lot of challenges, but they were quite smart about rolling this slowly to the community, partnering with us, and finding the right balance to do so. And it has been super successful when there is clear communication and there is advanced communication as well. So before we jump into education, though, I just want to see if there are any thoughts quickly here about message cohesion from either of you.
Well, this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier, that all the different aspects of the company need to line up with the overall message of safety in a welcoming community that you're trying to promote, right? So if you just have one part of the company that is focused on that, but it's undercut by other messages or other visuals from the company, I think that really does a disservice, and that's where it really needs to be. You need to have that buy-in from the top down, from the leadership down, as Nate was pointing out as well, in order for this to fully work.
Yeah, I just add that it's an observation that a lot of times companies are willing to spend a tremendous amount of money on their marketing messaging to bring people into a product. And if they were to apply the same sort of attention, discipline, and care in creating and crafting their messaging for the community, and training their people internally to be able to speak with that level of quality, that would be incredible. If you want to see a great example of this, take a look at Stuart Butterfield, who's the CEO of Slack. If you ever take a look at the work that he did with a product called Glitch, this was several years ago, the internal messaging was even better than the external messaging, and I think that was a really, really good decision.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to see how messaging is applicable to so many different levels of this topic here. And I just wanted to make one final comment before I move to the fourth pillar, which is related to, I know that we had some conversations about anonymity and how that's a factor, but a factor that's also super important when it comes to behavior online is the lack of consequences. So I think messaging, when you're talking about warning players or the messaging that goes when somebody's suspended, I think it's so important to put consequences, right? The clear consequences that can avoid a lot of issues, because people do behave the way they behave online because many factors, and one of those can be just the lack of consequences. That's very different from the social norms that we have when we are in let's say a nightclub or somewhere else. So I just wanted to also leave that note there.
Yeah, and to quickly tack onto that, Carlos, I mean, I think that's something that also would get in the way of the community really buying into the process of kind of self-policing to a certain extent, because if they report somebody and then they realize there's limited or no consequence, then they just start spreading the message that the company doesn't follow through, and therefore are going to be disincentivized to report issues in the future.
Absolutely.
Can I just? I'd love to add one bias to this. Whenever you're hiring your community people, because messaging and writing is so important, one of the things that I would recommend really getting into is what they're reading, what they've read. That really plays into this style of writing, and I think it's important.
Yeah, that's really excellent, Nate, because we bring our biases when we moderate, right? We have different biases depending on all circumstances from our lives, and if we have certain habits of reading habits and a certain understand that's broader, we're probably going to be able to make different decisions there and connect differently with those philosophies from the company. I think that's such an amazing point. And I just wanted to mention there too that, yeah, absolutely, when it comes to user reports, there is this perceived notion from different users at different companies that I have seen studies and conversations about. Users think that reporting somebody doesn't do anything. And absolutely, if you don't have that feedback loop and showing them that something happened, an action was taken, it can basically become a dead feature. Not to mention that there are different motivations for people to report different things, right? So making that as user-friendly and giving feedback is key. So if we go to the fourth pillar now, which is education, and obviously is fully connected with the previous one, I just want to make an important point here that education is important. You really want to have that education from the way that you're setting the tone of the product to how you educate via maybe blog posts or via messages in game, in the app, in the social platform that you have. But you have to also consider that just education doesn't necessarily do a lot of benefit. So if you think about, if we use an example of like transit systems, just saying don't drive above 100 kilometers per hour here might have some effect. If you put a barrier there, don't drive through this road, that has a lot of effect, right? That's the engineering. So engineering is super powerful in that sense. If you have enforcement, as in, oh, if you drive at that speed, you can get a ticket, that will have some consequences as well. But so don't just use education without follow-up, without the feedback loop, without consequences for your user. And again, involve the users so they can take ownership and they can also actually be heard and have a voice in how you're doing things. So we're talking about the 3 E's here that I referred to in the beginning. We're talking about education, enforcement that you're going to hear very soon in engineering. This is a concept that Ben Lewis Evans from Epic Games has shared at his DGC talk in 2015. So if you have a chance to watch this, it's super helpful. It's really good. He draws experience from his other jobs before working in games, but things that are concepts from psychology they're super applicable. And going back to that idea, engineering is super powerful. It's really related to the foundation of your product. But then you want to have education, and you also want to have enforcement. So we're getting to enforcement here. It's where, well, what happens when people don't follow the code of conduct, right? When people don't follow the rules of your community. It's important for us to bear in mind as well that for a lot of products actually that I have seen and talked to, it's sometimes less than 1% of the users and players who are the persistent people who are harassment and breaking the rules. So again, when we're moderating those that type of content, let's not think that that's representative of human nature absolutely, right? Because it's not necessarily the case. But we need to have enforcement plans to be able to deal with this. So when it comes to that, having clear consequences, again, timely action, just like we have for warnings. If I'm getting suspended, I need to know why I got suspended, but also what is the path for reform here? If I did something that's not applicable, sometimes I don't even know that that's not cool in this community here, or I think it's normalized behavior for me. I think that goes here. So what is the expected behavior? We should be very good at communicating what is the expected behavior. Having progressive sanctions as well, so folks can be warned, then they can maybe be muted or they can be suspended for X amount of hours before it escalates to a more serious type of enforcement. And like I mentioned, have the opportunity to reform, and sometimes we have to remove the persistent users who are being very negative. My apologies here that I'm plowing a little bit too fast here, just managing the time as fast as possible. I just want to mention as well that we have to go beyond enforcement alone, right? Beyond sanction alone. We can't dwell just on the negative aspects. Like I said, persistent negative action can come from less than 1% of users and players. So I really believe that healthy communities, they focus on the positive, they focus on engagement. And a great example I have on the screen there is what Roblox did with their players after the Hurricane Harvey situation, you know, like the disaster that happened there. They actually had in-game items that players could purchase, and all the money was directly donated to the hurricane relief, which is such an amazing story here, right? An example of the community rallying around something really important, a good cause, and then you have your community engaged on that and not really focus on the negative.
Before, sorry, go ahead, Nate.
I remember one bit of research that we did. We looked at the amount of reports and actionable reports that we got across, you know, like a couple month cycle back at Club Penguin. And one of the most interesting things that we saw was the amount of actionable reports drastically decreased whenever there was new content. And we saw it time and time again. And there was something about, when the community had something to do, to engage in, the behavior was just better. And again, this is a children's community. I wouldn't ever talk about this with a non-children's community, although I'm sure you could. But like to the point of purpose, there's great research has been done. We did some with us, and I've read some other research that looks at whenever you give purpose, or whenever there is activity, whenever there's reason, and whether it's helping hurricane victims or just doing something within the product itself that is meaningful and interesting and engaging. Idleness is the devil's playground. How do you say that again? What's that saying? Idle hands are the devil's playground. Anyways, I think idleness is a bad thing within a social product.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It can be applicable, I would argue, to other audiences as well. At the Community Management Summit at the Game Developers Conference, they were talking about, if your game is boring, and those were designers as well and community managers saying, if your game is boring, that could be conducive to people doing bad things to others. That becomes the game, right? So yeah, I think you make it engaging, you make it a positive experience. From the design, you can actually avoid some antisocial behavior. I would agree, and that's an amazing story. Thank you.
So really quick question. This is a great question, actually. Glitch was the single best community I ever had the privilege of participating in. Do you have any recommendations for a very small company trying to create a similar kind of environment feel?
Glitch was amazing. It was. To whoever said that, get in touch with me after. I'd love to know your thoughts on it. I got to work with Glitch for a short amount of time, and it was Disney was my becoming. Glitch was my humbling and relearning about what it meant to do community management and work with communities. And it was a very special place. And if whoever wrote that question, if you found another company like that, let me know, because I too would be interested. It was unique and special.
Hey, David, I was wondering if you would have any thoughts to share about enforcement and even focusing on the positive aspects of those interactions.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, given everything that's going on and some of the moving parts and kind of the rise of digital citizenship that we had mentioned earlier, you're going to start seeing kind of the combination of enforcement, but also better connecting with tutorials, right? With the enforcement, similar to any other aspect of life, where if somebody was struggling with something or they did something wrong, it might be sending them to a class of corrective behavior or enlightenment, if you will. And I think you're going to see more and more of that with digital citizenship. And there's a lot of free materials that are being created. And Carlos, it also kind of dovetails nicely with the project that you referred to as well with digital citizenship in kind of virtual communities. So I think that's just a prime opportunity for anybody dealing with these issues to see some of the educational materials that are being created, especially at the K through 12 level, but now also being aged up, that can be incorporated as learning opportunities for users. Because as we've talked about in previous discussions, a lot of users that maybe display antisocial behavior at first, oftentimes are able to correct that behavior and really become active and great members of the community. Kind of once they see the ramifications of some of their behavior online.
On the positive, let's dwell on that. What we can look forward to. Absolutely. So the last pillar here is about empowering meaningful work. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about, well, we have artificial intelligence, right? We have computers who are able to do amazing work and go through millions of pieces of content and pop out the things that humans should be looking at. So we can use computers to reduce the noise and really empower meaningful and purposeful human work. it also reduces the exposure to high risk content. Remember, we're talking about the health of your team. If the obviously severe and bad content can already be taken care by the computer, that reduces the exposure. And also having tools to allow you to moderate the community health and how this is fluctuating over time. So I think this is a good shout out here to All Tech is Human, which we referred to, but it would be great to hear from you, David, about this.
Sure. Yeah. All Tech is Human is a new initiative that kind of had a soft launch recently. It's based on the idea that there's a lot of disagreement right now between all the different stakeholders in technology with industry, organizations, education, students. But at the same time, we can all agree that all tech is human. It's made by humans. It should be for humans. It should be something that is increasing our connectivity to make us happier and healthier. In finding more joy. But I think to a large extent we've lost track of that to a certain aspect, but now can kind of connect. We recently had an event last Thursday in New York at Grand Central Tech where we had Lori Siegel from CNN, Anya Kamenetz from NPR, and Max Stossel from the Center for Humane Technology talking about ways to better align tech companies with the human interest of users and society.
Excellent. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Just want to actually, I'll plow through here so we can have final thoughts from everybody, just in the interest of time, so we can have a conversation as well here with the final minutes. Any final thoughts, Nate, David, and we'll open up for questions.
No, I think I kind of said my piece, so I'd love to kind of save a little time for some questions.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. All right, so let's hear what we have. You have already shared, asked some really excellent questions throughout, but it would be great to hear any final comments or questions that you have right now that we can take this opportunity.
Well, I have a quick question for the panel. So we have the 6 kind of essential pillars.
So the one thing that I would say that you can take today is, if you have the opportunity to do this from the ground up, even before the product goes live, that's golden. Have that community voice with the engineering voice, with the product voice. However, if you don't have that opportunity, well, just remember that a product is changing all the time. So try to find some really good data, some good stats in your community, some good ROIs that you can bring to other stakeholders in your company and show that this matters. Show that what impact this have. Use stats, use real numbers there that you can bring to the conversation.
Leah, I'm sure it was a really great question, but for some reason it cut out for me for the entirety of your question.
We'll see if Leah writes in, but
Oh, it's us now. Okay, so I think we've lost headquarters there.
I think we were muted here, I think. Sorry. Leah's question was, what's the one thing that people can take away from the session today to build a healthier online community? If you could leave them with one takeaway, what would it be?
Well, from my end, one of the things that I think is missing is that we're not viewing a healthy online community in a holistic fashion, where we're realizing that we have all these different spokes in the wheel, and that the actual community is one spoke in the wheel, and industry, or you as the company, are another spoke, right? It's not either or. Sometimes we toggle between it and say, all right, is it the responsibility of the community? Is it the responsibility of the company? Is it the responsibility of the parents? Whereas in reality, it works, again, just like crime, where you want everybody to buy in. You want everybody on board. And I think that's that's something we can certainly do by promoting digital citizenship as education, treating people as digital citizens as opposed to just users, and then having socially responsible companies that are actively trying to do the right thing and being very transparent in their rules and regulations, and then having enforcement that doesn't appear to be too willy-nilly or capricious, and it's based on something that the average person in the community is made aware of.
Excellent. It seems like we have a few questions here.
Yeah, we have 2 questions. I'm not muted, am I? Okay, awesome. So first question is, we have an app for kids, so everything gets moderated first before posting. We use a Buddy Press platform. Any other platforms would you suggest? Wonder, Nate, do you have any other platforms that you've used?
You know what? Everything that I've ever used has always been proprietary stuff that we've built, and unfortunately I'm not familiar with the platforms that are off the shelf.
Fair enough. So our next question, this is great actually. On the topic of team wellness, do you have any recommendations for establishing better practices in a tiny startup where folks are perhaps quite accustomed to overexerting themselves and wearing a few too many hats? I'm pretty sure every single person on the call today and has been talking today has experienced this.
Well, I can speak from the experience, and at a time that I was working with Nate, Nate was my leader, so I can speak to that time where we definitely took it very seriously, the content we were reviewing. We had constant alignment and discussions about this, and we took the time to spend time together outside of work as well. I think that was super important. If you have the chance to spend time together to build those bonds, build that openness, so things can be, when you're struggling with stress and you're in need of wellness, you can open up because you feel comfortable. I would say that's one of the best things you could do.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, who you work with in these situations, when you're crafting your teams that are going to look after the community and particularly look after some of the more challenging content, that team chemistry is really important. And it's not that you should necessarily hire like-minded people who are all usually going to get along. That's the lazy way to do it. But I mean, I think if you're leading a team like this, and whether it's a team of just you or a team of 2 or 3 people or a team of several hundred people, your number one job as a leader of that team is to serve and support that team to grow healthy, to be able to work with each other, to learn how to work through the differences. And for crying out loud, if you're going to be working with the community and trying to help foster and inspire healthy relationships, that should be what your internal operations look like, where you have people from a different background or a different viewpoint that have learned to kind of compromise and work together. The other thing that I would say in this is you can't overemphasize the importance of having a really strong purpose. And whenever you are hiring people, whenever you are working those crazy hours, if that's what you have to do, and if you're working on that content that is really challenging, you cannot put enough emphasis on the why behind why you're doing that. And you should talk about it all the time. It should be part of every decision that you make, because as soon as you forget that, as soon as you lose that and it starts to become about something else, then something else is going to take its place tacitly and intentionally. And that's where it starts to fester internally, and it will bleed into your community.
I love that, Nate. Yeah, I think looking back at my time as a moderator, all the times that I felt really empowered and I felt like I had much more joy and control over my tasks were when I had that motivation and that goal, that mission. It was like so clear in my mind. So I really appreciate that perspective. Do we have any more questions?
Nope, that was it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you staying even a little bit over time here. Appreciate the amazing questions. Everyone's time, of course. Thank you so much, David and Nate and Leah. Thank you for your thoughts, and I just wanted to see quickly here before I part ways that what we can do and what you can expect. Well, first is you can expect a PDF, a recording, and the Healthy Communities checklist. And in the material we're going to be sending you, you can find information too about where to find Nate and David in social media, their contact. It would be awesome to hear from you. If you can get in touch with us, keep the conversation. Let's have the conversation on social media. Let's have the conversation if we meet in conferences and in other places. I really think it takes a collective effort to push those digital citizenship projects forward. We need everybody's voice to do this. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Great
Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day, everyone. Really appreciate your sticking around for a couple extra minutes here.
Yes. Thank you.